am reading Ratzinger's Faith,
Okay.
which is a great introduction to the thought of our current Holy Father, Joseph Ratzinger, from when he was just Professor Father Ratzinger, through the time that he was the prefect of the Sacred Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, to the present moment, to now. It's written by Tracy Rowland, who is the current editor of the Australian edition of Communio magazine, so she's very familiar with his thought from over time. It goes through some major themes of his theology. It also corresponds to some major themes of the theology of Vatican II. I am also in the midst of reading Modern Spiritual Masters, which is a great little book, if I could only have it for maybe 10 days in a row to read it, because what happens is I keep ranting and raving about this book and reading little quotes from it to other sisters in the convent, and they keep borrowing my book. So I've only had this for about maybe 5 days over the last 5 weeks. Anyhow, it collects a number of writings, nice chunky selections from people who had a modern 20th century writers who have a deep, deep spirituality, but a great sensitivity to the needs of the world around them. And so it's contemplation in action, how concern for the world feeds our prayer, and how our prayer feeds our concern for the world. It's all part of one movement of taking our Christianity seriously, of taking our relationship with the Lord to heart and doing something about it. But it's a great, great, great book. But if you want to know what I read on the train coming up here, I'm in Boston right now, but I'm usually in Alexandria, Virginia. And this was my train book. Very good. See, here's my train ticket stub. Okay, this is what I read on the train coming up to Boston. And it's a novel based on the story of Gerard Manley Hopkins, who happens to be one of my favorite poets. In fact, it's probably one of the only poets that I really, really like. But it's the story of how he came to write the poem, his first major work, The Wreck of the Deutschland, or at least the first major work that we have, because he burned a number of his early poems at one point. Yep. But it goes through, it starts out with him in the novitiate in Wales, and how he was so affected by the story of the drowning of these passengers of the Deutschland, and included in that were some religious sisters who had been exiled from Bismarck's Germany, and were traveling to the New World. We're traveling to America to serve in the St. Louis area, and they were drowned along with all the other many of the other passengers. And he was so affected by that, he wrote this poem called The Wreck of the Deutschland. But Exiles, it parallels his own story of conversion and exile from his milieu. In effect, becoming Catholic, he became an exile to his family. He became an exile to the cultural literary world that he was involved in at that time in England. Being Catholic wasn't terribly chic. It was not. It was rather suspect, and he entered the Jesuits, who really didn't know what to make of this poet. They didn't recognize his poetic genius, didn't know what to do with him, and so all of his poetry was written for a very small audience of himself and maybe a few friends. Nothing ever came of it during his lifetime. And this book takes that parallel story of being exiled, of being pushed aside, and it does a beautiful job of showing faith in a very difficult place, and faith and creativity flourishing under extremely difficult circumstances. But in the meantime, it's just a good read.
My favorite book depends on the mood I'm in. Sometimes it's Sense and Sensibility. That's actually one of my favorites. It's also one of my favorite movies, the 6-hour one, not the little shorter ones. or Pride and Prejudice. I like Jane Austen a lot. But I also like, one of my favorite books that I do like to read when I'm feeling the need to be more spiritually filled is The God Who Won't Let Go.
Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic book. It really helps to build a person up when they're feeling like alone, isolated, lonely. It's a great book for that. To me, when I'm in a more fun mood or I need something to relax with, to read mystery that has recipes in it makes me very happy.
Can't get any better than that.
And I can't wait to start the next one.
Did you say they have different? Do they have different authors, or is it just this
Different
one?
authors. No, there's a lot.
And
I went
it's
into a bookstore, the world's biggest bookstore in Toronto,
Oh yeah.
and they actually had this section that was cooking up a good mystery. And so they were highlighting all of the various authors that have these cookbooks, these mysteries that have all the recipes in them. And because, like I said, that touches me and who I am and what I like to do, I couldn't help but like start to go through the books. And so I started writing authors' names down so I could look them up in the library. And so Diane Mott Davidson and Joanna Fluke are the ones I'm reading now. But there are about 6 or 7 different authors that do the same kind of a thing. And it's how they mix them together. And it's just, to me, it's a fascinating idea. And none of them seem to be really into the gore and the blood, which is good because I don't like that. But they do have the recipes, and it's always a fun little story.
Do they have them on CD too? Because
Yes, they do.
Yeah, okay.
They do.
Okay,
They do, because I've actually downloaded some to listen to them on my MP3 player.
Oh.
Diane Mott Davidson and Joanna Fluke are the ones I'm reading now, but there are about 6 or 7.
I'm really into the fathers and mothers of the desert. You know, so I've read maybe 4 or 5 different volumes. I'm just fascinated by their sayings and how they drew in their simplicity and their humility. They drew this group of people together around them. And it's not that they talked much or they did big things. It was really by just the example of their life. So I think that's what's really fascinating. And for most of them, they struggled a lot in life.
Something we can all identify with.
Yes, yes. So.
Well, it's not necessarily my favorite book, but I am getting pretty enthusiastic about this one. I'm almost finished with it. It's called Santa Biblia, the Bible Through Hispanic Eyes. And it is in English, otherwise I wouldn't be reading it. It's written by Justo Gonzalez and published by Abingdon Press in 1996. And it explores the value of cultural perspective in biblical interpretation, not to change the literal meaning of the text, but to offer insight into one's own life so that the Word of God becomes a living word for me, and in the context of the Hispanic family of faith, for us. So it can be read very profitably, both by Hispanics and by non-Hispanics like me.
What am I reading right now? Well, I just finished this great book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Eat, Pray, Love. I read it during my retreat, and I was very, very inspired, and I laughed and I cried with her and I prayed with her, and I marveled at what God has done in this woman. She's a seeker, and she really wants to force this experience with God by hook or by hook. I have to give her credit, because she was so down and out. She was depressed. She was on medication and upset that she was on medication, but yet she reached inside and she prayed to God. And you know what God told her? Go back to bed, Liz. And you know, that's the part of the book that hooked me. You know, that's a God I can relate to.